The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Karen Cho with Ian King. These are your headlines. SK Hynix's US offering raises $26.5 billion, with investor demand said to be 7 times oversubscribed ahead of today's listing on the Nasdaq.
US-Iran technical talks are reportedly still on the table despite this week's attacks. Oil on pace to snap a 4-week losing streak as flaring tensions reignite supply concerns. Volkswagen cuts capacity and halves its model lineup, but stops short of announcing 100,000 job cuts amid worker and union protests for now. The carmaker's Works Council says any cuts must be announced by today.
We kicked off the start of the trading week talking about the semiconductors, and it feels like we're going to end the week talking about semiconductors as well, thanks to SK Hynix and this listing stateside, but also Samsung at the start of the week with earnings.
Yeah. I mean, blowout numbers from Samsung, but a disappointing stock price reaction. But SK Hynix is just... This is potentially going to be as big an IPO as that of Saudi Aramco now. I mean, some of the numbers I'm seeing are just breathtaking.
Yeah, for me, the real takeaway was the re-rating that could occur for the stock, the re-rating that could occur for the South Korean stock market, which we know has been on a tear as well. So I thought that was fascinating, and how it's been in competition with the likes of Micron in the United States. But Micron has been able to bat above the average because it's had very deep capital markets, whereas SK Hynix has been the stronger play with much less capital.
Yeah, there's a really good piece on CNBC.com actually about this. I didn't realise SK Hynix only trades at sort of 4.8 times forward earnings, which is incredibly lowly, and yet the stock price is up 240% this year only. And as you say, Micron's up 250 times.
Yeah, which is fascinating because that goes to the heart of some of the issues. Look, these stocks, are they overvalued if you've had a spike of 200+% in the stock price year to date? So let's just dig into the weeds here on the listing, as SK Hynix has raised $26.5 billion in a US offering after it priced its ADR listing at $149, making it the largest listing in the US by a foreign company. Reports suggest that shares were more than 7 times oversubscribed. And let's get out to Lisa for more. Lisa, there was a big question as to how this would land in the market, given there were some digestion issues as we got going at the start of the week. Samsung didn't get a great reaction when it came to the market, even with a massive increase in profit. So just explain how this one has actually unfolded.
Yeah, Karen. So the chip giant says it sold around 178 million shares of ADRs for $149 each. And SK Hynix's U.S. share sales were reportedly more than 7 times oversubscribed, which really goes on to show investor demand for AI and HBM chips. SK Hynix is getting exposure to some American institutional investors who are limited to U.S. listed shares. And through this ADR listing, SK Hynix is eyeing to boost valuations and invest in building chip factories in Korea and buying chip making equipment. Going forward, investors will monitor to see if SK Hynix will be able to narrow the gap in valuation with its American rival Micron, which you guys referenced. And SK Hynix is the king of HBM chips and recorded profits comparable to Micron, yet the Korean company trades at a discount. So I've been asking this question to guests who have been coming on the network, and a common thread is that, that SK Hynix will likely get a bump in valuation through this ADR listing, but it'll be tough to completely close the gap entirely with Micron, because Micron is a name that's familiar to a lot of American investors, and also Micron's client base is mostly based in the U.S. Plus, SK Hynix still has room for improvement on the corporate governance front. Another point to watch is what this U.S. listing would do to SK Hynix's Korea-listed shares. UBS reportedly suggesting that investors sell their Korea-listed shares and buy ADRs instead, because it thinks that U.S. shares will likely be worth more than Korean ones. So far, SK Hynix is in the green today.
Lisa, thank you very much for that. I'm going to push on and take a look more broadly at the US chips and how they performed in session yesterday. It was a positive session around Micron, even as we talk about the fresh competition coming into the market with SK Hynix and the listing. The stock was still up 4.5%. AMD, I noticed one of the brokers actually just initiated coverage and was still very strong in the recommendations, 5.6% higher. SanDisk, look at that, 7.5%. And Marvel also getting very solid bounce. So right across the board, it felt as though the data center and the chip players were firmly back in focus. Let's move on to what we're seeing across in those Asian chip makers over the course of the week and what we've got on SK Hynix for the trading week. Still down as we talk about the strength that we've seen even on this listing on the ADRs. Samsung also in reverse and TSMC down slightly for the trading week. And the European chip plays as a result too. This is the wash up. We've seen some of the money come out of the European markets and it's also come out of technology. So ASMI, ASML all down across the course of the trading week, but faint declines on ST Micro. And this is, I think, one of the points to raise around the semiconductor trade this week is that the geopolitics came back in a big way. The MOU that we saw at the NATO summit, the fact that that was over, according to President Trump, and now questions as to where we go in terms of the Strait of Hormuz and the Middle East conflict. I think investors just flocked back around what they knew. They went, we can count on the earnings again from this sector. It doesn't get impacted necessarily by the geopolitics. Let's just race back in that direction for now. We'll think about the diversifiers later, but let's just go for what we can count on. Yeah,
really extraordinary rotation. I think the other factor that fascinates me, though, Karen, is the banking fees that are going to be accrued from this SK Hynix listing, something like $140 million. I mean, we're going to be talking about bank earnings later in the programme, but I mean, this has been an extraordinary quarter again for the banks. $500 million on SpaceX and now $140 million on SK Hynix. Just extraordinary. Indeed, certainly the banker fees to tally up. Just worth pointing out too the amount of news flow that we've had from the sector. We mentioned the Samsung earnings, we've got this listing, but we also had the Apple announcement early in the week, and this was the effective agreement with Broadcom, $30 billion in chips. So that massive contract had rolled across the tape as well. So you're getting a lot of news flow where that whole notion where investors are saying, oh God, are we done? Are we overpriced everything? Where do we sit in terms of capex? Can we fund this cycle? You've still got mega deals that are coming through from companies that know they need the capacity and know they need to have these deals in place. Yeah. And it gives another leg to the story, as you say. Yeah. Well, on a programming note, you can catch the chairman of the SK Group later on CNBC. That will be at 3 p.m. London time. OpenAI has unveiled its long-anticipated super app as it looks to compete with the likes of Anthropic's Claude Cowork and Microsoft's Copilot. ChatGPT Work looks to combine the chatbot with its Codex coding system to help create documents, presentations and websites. The new app will be powered by the AI firm's latest model, ChatGPT 5.6, which released yesterday after delays caused by the US government over national security fears. Well, speaking with CNBC yesterday, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman bigged up the company's latest model.
5.6 Sol, I think, is not only the best model in the world for most people, it's also much more efficient than other models out in the world. So it's 54% more token efficient on agentic coding tasks, and also, as good or better as the other best models out there. And we're really seeing people now start to care about efficiency, understand their spend, get a great ROI. So this is a great step forward for us.
Fiji Simo, OpenAI's number 2 executive, is to step down from her role at the company after going on medical leave, saying to staff in a note that her condition has worsened. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, which said that Simo, who led the AI company's product and business division, will remain a part-time advisor. Well, meantime, let's take a look at US futures and how we're setting up for the Friday trading session. The market looks somewhat mixed. We are seeing a slightly softer view on the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq seen out at this hour versus the Dow that is expected to eke out a slight gain at the start. Yesterday, we saw some gains. It was again concentrated around the Nasdaq. The likes of AMD, one of the big top movers in the chip space yesterday. So certainly powering ahead. FANG plus stocks on the front foot. ETFs that were VanEck Semiconductor, 2.5%. So you can see that tech-heavy play yesterday, but may not be the case this morning as we get going. But we do have some big breaking news. We do indeed, Karen. And this concerns EasyJet, the low-cost carrier, FTSE Mid 250 company. You'll remember that earlier in the week, Tail end of last week, over the weekend, it accepted an offer from Castle Lake, the Minneapolis-based private equity company. That was valued at £6.90p a share. That valued EasyJet at some £5.5 billion. That was recommended by the board. Well, this morning, the company has turned around and said that Apollo is proposing an all-cash offer of £7.15 a share. That would value EasyJet at £5.7 billion, and the board is minded to accept that. I think the board is going to end up with a bit of egg on its face here. The EasyJet board, of course, chaired by Sir Stephen Hester, the former Royal Bank of Scotland chairman, now NatWest, of course, and they were advised by some of London's premier advisors, including Roby Warshaw, Sir Simon Roby and Simon Warshaw, and they had obviously advised the board. But the original offer from Castle Lake was regarded as quite a low-ball offer. It had been well transmitted throughout the market, excuse me, that investors were looking for something with a 7 on the front. They were looking for at least £7 a share. They didn't get that from Castle Lake. The Castle Lake offer, I should say, by the way, was backed by Brookfield and by Goldman Sachs. Interestingly, now Apollo has come out and trumped them, given the investors what they wanted. The other interesting thing about any bid for EasyJet is that it has to pass muster with the EU, because any carriers that fly in and out of the EU must be EU based, and so there's going to have to be a big European element. So it'd be interesting to see how Apollo works its way around that. But as I say, a bit of egg on the face for the EasyJet board here.
Yeah, private credit versus private equity is what we're talking about. I think it's fascinating too, the timing, because we've had an eventful week around the Middle East. Yeah. To me, it felt as though EasyJet might just be playing for time, wait to get out of the situation around the Middle East, get a re-rating in the travel and leisure sector, stock price recovers, and then suddenly sort of out of the woods, the demand story comes back and travel, and maybe they have a good summer. But obviously the events this week means there's still a cloud of uncertainty around the sector. Maybe they can't bank on simply just riding it out, hoping that this may be behind them. There was
a good deal of unhappiness among EasyJet shareholders when Castle Lake broke, and the feeling was that this was a very opportunistically timed bid in view of the hit that EasyJet stock price took when Operation Epic Fury was launched against Iran at the end of February. Share price has obviously recovered since then on the back of this. But I wonder whether this is actually the end of the story, Karen. Now, obviously, as you say, Apollo have very deep pockets, but there's been an awful lot of speculation that a trade buyer is going to emerge for EasyJet at some point in time. Air France KLM is one that's long been linked in the market with a bid for EasyJet. International Airlines Group, the owner of British Airways and Aer Lingus, they may too have a look at it. I mean, the attraction behind EasyJet is these landing slots that they have at Gatwick, incredibly valuable. So it would be a very, very valuable addition to either Air France KLM or IAG. Fascinating. It sounds like EasyJet and the board are willing to engage on this one, saying that effectively they're looking at it, aren't they? Which is a friendlier sounding tone than what we've had before. It's up for grabs. Yeah. Well, coming up on the show, oil looks set for a sharp weekly gain as tensions flare between the United States and Iran, but diplomatic efforts have not yet derailed entirely. We'll have the latest from the region. Plus, Andy Burnham needs just one more Labour Party nomination to become Prime Minister. And we'll discuss the IEA's latest monthly oil report with the agency's head of Oil Industry and Markets Division. That conversation coming up at 9 o'clock London time.
Executive Decisions is the new podcast from CNBC, where I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything. I'm Steve Sedgwick. Here's the CEO of the London Stock Exchange Group, Julia Hoggett.
There is no justification whatsoever for not doing the right thing, even if the right thing is hard to do. Which also means that if the context changes or the information changes, it is absolutely fine to also change your mind.
That's Executive Decisions with me, Steve Sedgwick. Get it wherever you're listening to this.
The president wants to see that shift in burden. It's happening. That momentum is picking up.
Europe is stepping up. And I think we are doing that in a responsible way. The rhetoric of this leader or that leader, we have to live with that.
There must be one club, and this club should be called 5% club.
If you're asking, is NATO working? And if I'm confident that NATO is working, I'm absolutely confident. We are ready to defend every inch of NATO, including our own territory.
We are here to solidify each other and recognize the main threat of Russian Federation.
Who has won, who has lost? I say Ukraine has won.
Time is not on Russia's side right now unless we allow it to be.
An alliance needs to be based on the fundamental principle of good neighborly relations.
Over the past year, Europe has shown that with greater unity, we can actually better protect our own continent.
Well, that was just a snapshot of CNBC's coverage of this year's NATO summit. World leaders gave their thoughts on some of the biggest questions weighing on the alliance, as well as the diplomatic dance with US President Donald Trump and how that played out. From leaders bracing for a confrontation to pivoting to talk of a love-in with Trump, the NATO summit in Ankara had it all. However, major questions on Iran, Ukraine and the future of Washington's role in the alliance remain unanswered. For an on-the-ground perspective dealing how the world seemed to move on Trump's timeline for 48 hours in Turkey, check out Steve's piece on CNBC.com. Now, the US will engage in technical talks with Iran and remains committed to finding a solution to the conflict, a US official has told MS Now. Well, this despite several days of Washington and Tehran exchanging fire and US President Donald Trump saying a ceasefire was over. Iran buried its late supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, killed at the start of the war following a week of mass funeral events. His son, who is his successor and was badly injured in the strike which killed his father on February the 28th, did not appear at any of the events. He's yet to be seen in public since the war began. Well, Emma Graham joins us now. Emma, the fact that we haven't seen Khamenei's son since the war, I mean, presumably that is because he's pretty badly injured.
Yeah, good morning, Ian. Good to see you. Amazing pictures there out of Mashhad. And absolutely, we haven't seen any sign of the new supreme leader. He was obviously in that attack on February 28th, where his father was killed, along with several members of his family. And it's really significant. Other siblings of his brothers were there commemorating Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has been laid to rest now in Mashhad after a 6-day funeral procession through Iran and Iraq. And it comes as blasts are reported across southern Iran this morning, including near Iran's nuclear plant. But the American military have insisted they've not conducted any strikes on Iran this morning since those U.S. operations, which concluded yesterday morning. They killed at least 14 people and injured dozens, according to Iranian state media. And this all comes as Tehran lashes out at Gulf and Arab neighbors yesterday, striking Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. We also saw sirens blaring across Qatar, who are one of the key negotiators with Iran, and the U.S. as well. And after all this, it seems diplomacy is hopefully prevailing. And reports this morning from MS Now that the U.S. will continue technical talks, as you mentioned, with Iran, despite those recent strikes. And President Trump leaving the door open to this as well. Iran also reportedly remains committed to finding a resolution. And my sources there have told me the same thing. But it could go either way, they've said. Despite these new airstrikes between the two countries in recent days, all of this seems to be coming towards diplomacy. We also saw the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, speaking with foreign ministers across the region. So it seems, Ian, there is an effort towards diplomacy, and we'll see what the coming days will bring.
Great stuff. Thanks, Emma.
Meantime, Fed Chairman Kevin Warsh has appointed 15 leaders to run 5 new task forces to modernise the US central bank. Appointees include former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King, tech investor Mark Andreessen, and Xbox CEO Asha Sharma. Joining us now is Kamishai Trivedi, who is Chief FX and Emerging Market Strategist at Goldman Sachs. Kamishai, thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking about this task force and how interesting it could get, but it's become more interesting overnight as some of the names we've revealed. A lot of names that we've all come across in various walks of life or we've followed in terms of their central banking or business practices. So how are you thinking about how policy could be reshaped by such interesting names?
Look, it's a seriously impressive slate of people who have been appointed to these task forces. You know, people, as you said, who have experience in a lot of different walks of life. I think that, one of the things that this is doing is it's kind of buying time for Chairman Walsh, I think, to get to the end of the year and kind of see how just the overall macro outlook evolves. The Fed has looked at some of these issues in recent years. So in some sense, I think I will also be curious to see how much, actually the substance of the communication and the data usage changes, as opposed to some of the forms that have, changed over the years a number of times. So I think that, you are going to see, some differences, but I think it's really about that substance, and I think giving time to Chairman Walsh to see how the macro outlook evolves.
To me, 2026 has been a year where the dollar's status as a reserve currency has not been tested. Yeah. It's proved resilient. You've had some buying thanks to the stronger yield scenario where the interest rates are going to be higher than the market had anticipated. But if we dig into what these task forces are going to be doing, you wonder whether any of this is going to dent the appeal of the US dollar. I mean, we've got communications, and we know that is a big factor for how the Fed is communicating with the markets. Balance sheet data, the gathering of particular different touch points on the economy, productivity, jobs and inflation. Does any of this have any bearing, do you think, on how the US dollar could trade?
I think if you step back and think about it, I mean, one of the things we have found is that, for a reserve currency like the dollar, and you're absolutely right that I think the dollar has come through the tests this year very well, and I think in fact it's kind of reinforced a little bit its sort of role as a credible currency and a credible backstop. We have found that increased transparency is associated with somewhat lower volatility that kind of reinforces this role of a sort of reserve currency. But it doesn't really matter precisely what form that transparency comes in, whether it comes in precisely through dot plots, whether through other kinds of communication, through speeches. And so I am less worried about the fact that you may see some changes in the way this is presented as that having any major risks to the role of the dollar or the dominance of the dollar. I really don't think that is that issue here. But I think that, one would like to see, that kind of broader trend towards transparency in kind of how central banks operate, how they're thinking about the world. I think that will be important.
Whilst the personnel in this task force are undoubtedly impressive, isn't this going to increase a bit of cynicism about central bank groupthink? I mean, it's not that long ago since Ben Bernanke was advising the Bank of England on how to improve the quality of its forecasting.
Yeah, I mean, you could see, some fan charts going the other way. I mean, that's certainly possible. But no, look, I think, a lot of these things come with a certain institutional heft and certain institutional history, which will be different in the case of the Fed than it has been in the case of the Bank of England. And I think it's useful to have perspective from, the outside world, which they have some, private sector participants as well as some academics, people like Rod Chetty on the data task force, somebody who's done a lot of work with big data. I think it's good to look at these things with a fresh pair of eyes from time to time.
Is there any sense in your mind that this is an admission from Kevin Walsh that the Fed isn't doing as good a job as it could be? I mean, he was obviously pretty critical prior to becoming chairman.
I don't think of it that way. I think, he's, coming in with, obviously with a new mandate. And I think, he wants to put his stamp on the way things are done. And I think take some time to get there. I think that, Chair Lagarde also did something like this. You had the expert committees when she first came in. So I think it's quite typical. I think it also gives them some time to kind of get their policy bearings, get their sort of view on the macro outlook, and also find a way to take the committee along with them. So I don't think of this in a sort of cynical fashion. What I do think it does is, in my mind, it kind of raises the odds that not much happens in terms of Fed decision making for the next few months as these task forces get together and actually come back with their conclusions.
I want to push on to the yen. We've seen movement in dollar yen rates. We're 161. The bond markets and currency markets now looking at another factor at play here, and that is the Team Japan. Mm-hmm. The finance minister is suggesting that they want to look at a way to get the government pension investment fund, GPIF, to increase their holdings in domestic assets. Is this a positive factor trying to put a prop underneath the Japanese yen?
It clearly is, and in some sense, I mean, that is the kind of holy grail. I mean, if you think about the yen or the dollar yen, I mean, this is at historically cheap levels, right? Like, you haven't been at these levels in 30, 40 years. It's super undervalued in all our metrics. And a big part of the reason is not because Japan is struggling in terms of its trade balance or anything like that. It is the capital account, right? It is the fact that Japanese investors, pension funds, asset managers invest, a lot abroad. And frankly, they've done very well by doing that, especially in the context of the fact that the yen has weakened so far. So I think that, if there was a serious shift in repatriation flows, if there was a big move to bring these back, I think those would be very meaningful for the yen. And I think that's what the market is reflecting overnight. But so far, this is a comment. This is an exhortation. This is, something that is, I think of it like verbal intervention that they often do with the yen. I think that there's many steps to go between this and actually seeing repatriation in a more meaningful way, whether that makes economic sense and whether that will, the big asset managers, the big pension funds, GPI, whether they kind of sign up to that. There's a lot of institutional process there. So it's a step, but I think of it as verbal intervention. And it doesn't change the underlying macro dynamic, which is pushing towards weaker yen. We have a world in which equity prices are going up, rates are high, energy prices are high. All of these things push towards a weaker yen. And so until that macro shift changes, I think these are going to be periodic resets, but ultimately the push is going to be towards a weaker yen.
OK, well, we've mentioned one currency that you're bearish on. You're very positive on the Egyptian pound still.
We are, yeah. I mean, look, I think it's a very positive environment generally for carry, I would say. I think that one of the things that is happening here is that, higher yielding, higher carry currencies are doing pretty well, especially given that we've now, to some extent, clearly not completely, as we've seen headlines last few days, put the energy price volatility a little bit back into the box, right? And I think that if you take up that really upside tail, the really adverse tail of very high energy prices and very high Fed interest rates, I think that narrowing of distribution and lower macro vol is good for carry. And the Egyptian pound, offers that, a lot of that carry offers that sensitivity to slightly lower oil prices. And yeah, we are pretty constructive on it.